I used to teach 120 children how to read. Now I don't even have an address to receive mail. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 35 years old. And for the last 8 months, my home has been a 1998 Honda with a broken heater and a passenger seat that won't recline anymore. I lost my classroom to a lie. I lost my husband to that same lie. And I lost my little girl, Emma, 2 years before any of that. She was 5. The disease had a long name. What it took from us was very short. I thought I had nothing left to lose. Then a lawyer I'd never heard of called me on a rainy Tuesday in October. She said my grandfather had died. She said he'd left me something. I laughed out loud in the parking lot of a truck stop. Because the grandfather I remembered had walked out on my family when I was 8 years old. He was a ghost, a shadow, the first man to teach me that people you love can just disappear. But that rusted brass key she handed me, the one marked 413, it wasn't the end of a stranger's story. It was the beginning of mine, and what I found inside, that storage unit didn't just change my life. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about who loved me. The rain in October always feels different, colder, heavier, like the sky knows something you don't. I was sitting in my Honda in the parking lot of a truck stop off Route 219, listening to the wipers scrape across a windshield they couldn't quite clean. The heater had died 3 weeks ago. My breath was fogging up the glass. My hands were tucked between my thighs to keep them warm, and on the passenger seat sat a letter I'd read 4 times, without understanding a single word. Because the words didn't make sense. Because the words said my grandfather was dead. And my grandfather had been dead since I was 11 years old. My mother told me so. She said it at the kitchen table in that flat voice she used for bad news. She said, "Henry's gone, Claire. He was gone before your father and mother went. Don't ask about him again." I didn't. Not for 24 years. Except now this woman named Margaret Ashford was telling me he'd died 3 months ago, in July, in a town called Cedar Hollow that I'd never heard of, that he'd left me something. Him. The man who'd walked out on our family when I was 8 years old. The man who taught me that the people you love the most can just vanish. Like smoke. Like a light switching off. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Unknown number. Again. I let it ring. Let me back up. Let me tell you how I got here. Because you're probably wondering what a 35-year-old woman is doing sleeping in her car in October. And the honest answer is, I don't fully know either. I know the pieces. I know I used to have a classroom on the 2nd floor of Riverside Elementary. Room 214. I know it had a reading corner with beanbag chairs I bought myself off Amazon, and a jar of jelly beans I gave out on Fridays, and a bulletin board that said where the wild readers are in construction paper letters my students helped cut out. I know I taught 3rd grade, 12 years, 120 children in total. I remember every single one of them. That's not a brag. That's just what happens when you love your job. I know I had a husband named Ethan Marlowe, who wore glasses when he read, and always burned the first pancake on purpose, because he said it was the sacrifice pancake. I know we lived in a yellow house on Chestnut Street with a wraparound porch and a swing that squeaked no matter how much WD-40 you sprayed on it. And I know we had a daughter, Emma. She had my dark hair and Ethan's freckles and a laugh that sounded like she was being tickled by air. She was 5 when we lost her. Leukemia. That's the short version. There is no long version I can say out loud yet. That was 2020. We tried. We tried for 2 years after. Ethan and I. We tried the way people try when they know the marriage is already dead, but they can't quite admit it. We ate dinner in silence. We went to therapy. We slept on opposite sides of a king-size bed that felt like the Pacific Ocean. And then, in March of 2023, everything else fell apart too. Which brings me to Vanessa Prescott. Vanessa Prescott was our new assistant principal. She was 31 years old. She had highlights that cost $400 and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She was also, unfortunately, the daughter-in-law of our principal, a woman named Colette Prescott, who ran Riverside Elementary the way a warden runs a prison. I noticed the money first. the charity fund, the one we ran for kids who couldn't afford field trips or winter coats. I'd been on the committee for 6 years. I knew the numbers. The numbers were wrong. Small at first. 100 here, 200 there. Then not so small. By April, I'd traced $47,000 in receipts to invoices that didn't exist. Vendors that didn't exist. A whole paper trail leading straight to Vanessa Prescott's desk. I did what any reasonable person would do. I reported it. That was my mistake. Because within 72 hours, there was a complaint filed against me. An anonymous complaint. From a parent who was never named. Claiming I had been, and I'm going to use the exact language because it still burns, inappropriately physical with a student. A student. Me. The woman who read Charlotte's Web out loud. With tears in her eyes every May. The investigation was fast. The suspension was faster. My license was pulled pending review. The union told me they'd stand by me, and then they stopped answering my calls. And Ethan believed it. For 36 hours he believed it. That was enough. He said, "Claire, we need to talk." I said, "You know me." He said, "Do I?" And that was the end of 8 years. The divorce took 4 months. He kept the yellow house. He kept the car with the working heater. He kept the framed drawings Emma had made, every single one, because his lawyer moved faster than mine, and I was too tired to fight. I moved into a Motel 6 off the highway, then a weekly rental, then my car. I didn't tell my mother. My mother is in a memory care facility in Ashwood, and she has good days and bad days, and on the bad days she thinks I'm her sister who died in 1978. I visit when I can afford the gas. I sit in the vinyl chair by the window. I hold her hand. I tell her I'm doing fine. She always says the same thing on the good days. She says, "Claire, you're my beautiful daughter. You're a teacher. Everyone loves you." And I nod. And I smile. And I don't correct her. Because what am I going to say? Not anymore, Mom. Not anymore. Which brings us back to the parking lot. To the rain. To Margaret Ashford's letter. Sitting on the passenger seat like a live grenade. I picked it up. I read it a 5th time. "Dear Ms. Bennett, I represent the estate of your grandfather, Mr. Henry Bennett, who passed away on July 14, 2024. Per his final instructions, you are the sole beneficiary of a specific bequest. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience." That was it. No details. No explanation. Just a phone number and an address downtown. I sat there for a long time. I thought about ignoring it. I thought about tearing it up and driving away and pretending I'd never gotten it. I had exactly $43 in my checking account and a quarter tank of gas and a dozen more urgent problems than a dead stranger's paperwork. But he was my grandfather. But there was something about the way my hands were shaking that told me this wasn't a thing I could throw away. I picked up my phone. I dialed. Margaret Ashford had an office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and expensive coffee. I sat in her waiting room in the cleanest clothes I owned, a gray sweater with a small hole in the elbow and jeans I'd washed in a laundromat sink the night before. I'd spent 45 minutes in a Starbucks bathroom scrubbing my face. My hair was pulled back in a bun that was trying very hard to look intentional. The receptionist offered me water. I said no thank you. She offered me coffee. I said no thank you. She offered me a pastry from a little basket and I almost cried, and I said no thank you. I hadn't eaten since yesterday. Margaret Ashford was in her 50s. Silver hair in a clean bob. Half-moon glasses on a beaded chain. The kind of woman who probably owned a golden retriever and a house in the country and had never once slept in a car. She was kind. That was the worst part, because kindness sneaks in through the cracks. She sat me down. She poured me coffee anyway. She slid a manila folder across her desk. Then she reached into her drawer, and she pulled out a key. It was heavy. That was the first thing I noticed. It was heavy and dark and older than me by a lot. Brass, tarnished almost black at the tip. A faded plastic tag hung from it, and the tag had 3 numbers on it in permanent marker. 4, 1, 3. "Your grandfather," Margaret said. was very specific about this. He wanted it to go directly to you. Nothing else in the estate, just this. I picked it up. It was cold. He left you the contents of a storage unit, Ms. Bennett. Unit 413, at a facility called North Ridge Storage, in a town called Cedar Hollow. It's about 5 hours northwest of here, up in the mountains. I nodded, because nodding is what you do when you don't know what to say. The lease is paid through April. After that, it becomes your responsibility. She paused. There's one complication. Of course there was. The land the facility sits on was recently purchased by a development company. Blackstone Development. They're planning to build a resort. All the storage tenants have been given notice. How much notice? I asked. She hesitated. 12 days. 12. I almost laughed. 12 days. To sort through the estate of a man I hadn't seen in 27 years. In a town I'd never heard of. 5 hours away. With $43. Ms. Bennett, she said gently. There's also this. She slid an envelope across the desk. Cream-colored, thick, my name on the front. In shaky, careful handwriting I did not recognize. Claire. Just Claire. Like he'd been calling me. That for 27 years even, when I couldn't hear him. I put the envelope in my pocket. I put the key in my other pocket. I stood up. I said thank you, and I walked out of that office into the rain, and I sat in my Honda, and I put my forehead against the steering wheel, and I did not cry. Because I didn't have time to cry. I had 5 hours to drive. The road to Cedar Hollow climbed. That's the only way to describe it. Climbed. Out of the flat gray of the valley, up through hills that turned to mountains, past shuttered gas stations, and hand-painted signs for firewood and boiled peanuts. The Honda groaned on the inclines. The radio lost its signal somewhere around the second hour, and never got it back. I drove in silence. I thought about Emma. I always think about Emma when I drive alone. It's the worst time. It's when she comes back, not as memory exactly, but as absence. As the shape of the empty car seat that used to be in the back. As the way she used to sing along to songs on the radio, wrong lyrics, top of her lungs, and Ethan and I would look at each other in the rearview mirror and just smile. Sometimes I still smile now. Alone. In the car. I don't know if that means I'm healing or losing my mind. I thought about my mother, too. I thought about the last time she'd been herself. Really herself. It was Christmas 2021. She'd made a ham. She'd sung along to the record player. And she'd sat me down on the couch after everyone else went to bed and said, Claire, honey, if anything ever happens to me, anything, you remember something for me. I said, what? She said, your grandfather loved you. I said, Mom, he left us. And she looked at me for a long time. And she said, some things aren't what they look like, baby. And then she'd gotten up and gone to bed. And I hadn't thought about that moment in 3 years. Until right now. Until the road to Cedar Hollow. Until the key in my pocket was starting to feel less like an inheritance, and more like a question I'd been avoiding my whole life. I thought about my grandfather too. Just one memory. I was 6. We were down at the river behind his house in Millbrook. He was teaching me to skip stones. I couldn't do it. I kept throwing them too hard. They just sank. I stamped my foot. I said, I can't do it. He knelt down next to me. Old knees. Loud creak. He put a flat gray stone in my hand. He said, Claire, you don't punch the water. You kiss it. You let the stone tell the water hello, and the water lets it go. He closed my fingers around the stone. He said, Bennett's don't punch. Bennett's kiss the water. I threw. For skips. He hooped. He picked me up. He spun me around. I laughed until I couldn't breathe. 2 years later, he was gone. I hadn't thought about the river in 27 years either. Until now. Until the road. Cedar Hollow appeared out of the trees like it was hiding. One Main Street. A hardware store. A post office with a flag that had seen better decades. A church with a white steeple that looked like it had been painted last week. And, on the corner where the highway met the town, a diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, Ruth's Kitchen Open Coffee 1:50, Pie 3. My stomach made a sound I don't want to describe. I pulled into the gravel lot. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like a woman who had spent 5 hours crying without crying. I ran a hand through my hair. I got out of the car. The bell over the door jingled. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first, bacon and coffee, and something with cinnamon. My knees actually buckled a little. The place was mostly empty. A couple of old men in a corner booth. A trucker at the counter reading a newspaper. And behind the counter, wiping down the same spot she'd probably been wiping for 40 years. A woman with silver hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She looked up when I came in. She looked at me. She stopped wiping. The rag fell out of her hand, onto the counter. And she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Oh my God." I froze in the doorway. I said, "I'm sorry." She was walking around the counter. Faster than a woman her age should walk. She was maybe 70. Broad-shouldered. Blue eyes that were already filling with water. She stopped 3 feet from me. She said, "You're his granddaughter." I said, "I'm sorry, Dewey." She said, "You're Claire." My blood went cold. Because I hadn't told her my name. Because I hadn't told anyone in this town anything. Because I was a stranger, who had walked in wet, and hungry and lost. And this woman I had never met had looked at my face, and known exactly who I was. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. She reached out. She touched my cheek. Just for a second. Just the back of her fingers against my jaw. Like she was making sure I was real. Then she pulled her hand back and said quietly, "He kept your picture in his wallet, honey. For 27 years. I've been looking at your face across this counter almost every morning." I heard myself say, "Who are you?" She smiled. Small, sad, kind. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Come sit down. You look like you haven't eaten in a week." I hadn't. I sat down. She fed me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask where I'd come from or why I was there or whether I could pay. She just started cooking. Eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone who understood that coffee is a small act of love. She set the plate in front of me. I said, "I can't afford." She said, "Henry's family doesn't pay in this diner." And I lost it. Right there. In a red vinyl booth. Face in my hands. Shoulders shaking. 26 years of a story I'd been told. Cracking open right down the middle. Ruth didn't come sit with me. She didn't hug me. She didn't say it's okay, or don't cry, or any of the other things people say when they don't know what to do with a woman falling apart in public. She just stayed at the counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She waited, and after a while, when I could breathe again, she came over. She sat across from me. She wrapped her hands around her mug, and she said, "Now, tell me why you came." I did. Not all of it. Not Ethan. Not Emma. Not the 8 months in the car. Just the letter, the lawyer, the key. I pulled it out of my pocket and set it on the table between us. 4, 1, 3. Ruth looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "He knew you'd come. Even when he wasn't sure himself. He said, Ruth, one day my Claire will walk in that door, and you'll know her by her eyes. She has her grandmother's eyes." I said, "I don't have a grandmother. I never met her." Ruth smiled again. "No," she said, "you didn't, but you have her eyes." North Ridge Storage was a mile out of town. Ruth wouldn't let me go alone. She locked up the diner in the middle of the afternoon. "Not a soul comes in on Tuesdays anyway," she said, and got into my Honda without waiting for an invitation. She directed me, left at the church, right at the split rail fence, down a gravel road that ran along a creek. The facility was exactly what you'd expect. Rows of long metal buildings, red paint faded to something like dried blood, a chain link fence, a gate that stood open, a little office with the lights off, and a note on the door. Parked. I got out. The wind-up here smelled like pine, and cold water. Ruth got out too. She didn't say anything. She just walked beside me down the row of numbered doors. 200, 300, 350, 400, and there it was. 4, 1, 3. The door was red like the others. The rust was worse at the bottom. The padlock was heavy and modern and covered in a dull patina of neglect. I took out the brass key. I put it in the lock. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't fit. The key was old. The lock was new. And for one horrible second I thought, this is it. This is the joke. This is the last laugh from a man who never came home. I turned to Ruth. She was already smiling. That same small sad smile. She said, "Look up, honey." I looked up. Tucked under the metal lip of the roof, coated in 20 years of dirt, was a small magnetic lockbox. The kind people hide spare car keys in. My hands were shaking as I pulled it down. I opened it. Inside, on a piece of foam, was a single silver key. Ruth said, "He always said the important things are worth reaching for." The padlock was stiff. I put my whole body into it. The bolt cracked open like a bone. I gripped the handle. I took a breath. Ruth stepped back, giving me space, and I lifted the door. The smell hit me first. Not decay, not mothballs, not the sour dust I'd braced for. Sawdust. Sawdust and cedar and pipe tobacco. The smell of a workshop that had been loved. The smell of a man I hadn't seen since I was 8 years old. I gasped. I actually gasped out loud, because the memory came all at once. His workshop behind the house in Millbrook. The sound of the plane running over pine. The way he'd hold up a piece of finished wood to the light and say, "Look at that grain, Claire. That's God showing off." I hadn't thought about that in 27 years. My knees gave out. Ruth caught my elbow, steadied me. "Take your time, sweetheart," she said. "He waited a long time. He can wait a little longer." I stepped inside. The light from the doorway cut across the concrete floor. Dust motes danced in the beam. And slowly, my eyes adjusted. It was a workshop. A whole, complete, meticulously organized workshop. A workbench against the back wall, its surface scarred, with the marks of 1,000 projects. A pegboard above it, with tools hanging in perfect order, planes, chisels, handsaws, their wooden handles dark and smooth with use. A tool cabinet along one wall. Cans of finish and stain lined up on a shelf, labels facing out. And boxes. Cardboard boxes stacked almost to the ceiling. Neatly labeled in black marker. I walked closer. Claire, age 5. Claire, elementary school. Claire, high school. Claire, college. Claire, wedding. And then one more. Down at the bottom. In smaller, shakier handwriting. Emma. Couldn't breathe. I sank to my knees in front of that box. My hands were shaking, so badly I could barely open the flaps. Inside, a newspaper clipping. From the Riverside Gazette. May 2019. Local kindergartner wins county art contest. A picture of Emma in her yellow dress, holding up her drawing of a sunflower field. I hadn't sent him that. I hadn't sent him anything. I'd never even known he existed. But he'd known about her. He'd cut out this clipping. He'd folded it carefully. He'd put it in a box. Underneath it, a small carved wooden bear, about the size of my palm. Cedar. Sanded smooth. The kind of thing a grandfather makes for a grandchild he'll never meet. I picked it up. I held it against my chest. And I sat there on the concrete floor of a storage unit in a town I'd never heard of. And I rocked back and forth like a woman at a wake. Because in a way I was. Ruth stayed in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. Hands folded in front of her, not looking at me, giving me the dignity of grief. After a long time I stood up. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. I looked around the unit. And I saw it, on the workbench, placed exactly in the center, like it had been waiting for me. An old olive drab metal box, the kind soldiers used to store ammunition. And on the top, painted in careful white block letters, was one word. Claire. Just my name. I walked to it. I put my hands on it. The latches were stiff. They popped open with a small metallic sigh. I lifted the lid. Inside, no money, no jewelry, no object of any obvious value. Just letters. Stacks and stacks of cream-colored envelopes, bound together with plain kitchen twine. Dozens. No, hundreds. Each one addressed the same way. Claire. Just Claire. And on top of the whole stack, held in place by a folded piece of masking tape, was one final envelope, with a note stuck to the front. 6 words. In that same shaky handwriting. Read this one first, my girl. I sat down on an old iron-bound chest against the wall. The metal was cold through my jeans. Ruth stepped inside the unit for the first time. She walked slowly. She didn't touch anything. She stopped a few feet from me. She said, "I'll wait outside." I said, "No." I didn't recognize my own voice. I said, "Please stay." She sat down next to me on the chest. Our shoulders touched. She didn't say a word. I opened the envelope. The paper was thick, soft, expensive. He'd spent money on this. I read, "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I am so sorry for that. I am sorry for so many things more than one letter can hold. I know you have questions. I know you may hate me. I would not blame you if you did. The story you were told that I just left, that I abandoned your father, that I stopped loving all of you, that is the story I needed you to believe. It was the only way I knew how to keep you safe." I stopped reading. I looked at Ruth. She was staring straight ahead at the workbench. Her eyes were wet. She whispered without turning her head, "Keep going, honey." He worked on this letter for a long time. I kept going. "Your father, my son, was a good man in his heart. But he was a gambler. Not with cards. Not with horses. With people. He borrowed from men who did not take apologies as payment. When he could not pay, those men decided to teach him a lesson. They did not come after him first. That would have been too easy. They were smarter than that. They came after you." I stopped breathing. I actually stopped breathing. The ammo box in my lap felt suddenly heavy, like it was full of something more than paper. Ruth put her hand over mine. She didn't say a word. "You were 8 years old, Claire. You had a pink jacket with a bunny on the pocket. You went to Willow Creek Elementary. You walked home from the bus stop past the Hendersons' house every day at 3:14 in the afternoon. They knew all of this. They wanted us to know they knew. A car started following your mother home from the grocery store. Just following. Just close enough. Just often enough. One morning, all 4 tires on her sedan had been slashed. In the driveway. In the night. Your father was terrified. Your mother was terrified. And I was terrified too. But I was also old. And your grandmother had been gone 6 years by then. And I looked at your father, and I looked at your mother, and I looked at you, my little Claire, with your pigtails and your library books, and I understood something. As long as I was there, as long as your father knew he had a father to fall back on, he was a pressure point they could squeeze. They knew he would do anything for you. They knew I would do anything for him. So I made a choice. I made a deal with them. I took on the entire debt. Every dollar. In exchange, they would leave your father and your mother and you alone. Forever. The only condition was that I had to disappear. I could never contact any of you. If I did, the deal was off and everything I had done was for nothing. I had to become the villain in your story so that you could have a story at all. I told your father terrible things that last night. Things that were not true. Things that would make him hate me enough to stop looking for me. I have replayed that fight in my head every single night for 27 years. He believed me. Your mother believed me. You believed me. And I walked out into the rain and I got on a bus, and I did not look back. Because if I had looked back, I could not have kept going. The letter fell out of my hands. It fluttered to the concrete floor. Couldn't see. My eyes were full. My throat was closed. I put my hands over my face, and I made a sound I have never made in my life. Some animal thing, some low broken thing, that started in my chest and came out of my mouth without permission. Ruth pulled me against her shoulder. She held me the way my mother used to hold me, back when my mother remembered how. She rocked me back and forth on that iron-bound chest, and she said over and over, quietly, into the top of my head, "He loved you. He loved you. He loved you." I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light in the doorway changed color. Long enough that the shadows across the concrete floor lengthened and softened. Ruth handed me a napkin from her apron pocket. Ruth kept napkins in her apron pocket. Of course she did. I wiped my face. I picked up the letter. I finished it. "I will not lie to you, Claire. I have lived a small life since I left. A quiet life. I worked in a woodshop in a small town in the mountains. I made cabinets and tables and chairs for people who never asked me my last name. I went to church on Sundays. I lit a candle every week. The candle was for you. I followed your life the only way I could. From a distance. Through the public record. Through a small handful of people who agreed to keep my secret. You will meet one of them, I think. Her name is Ruth. She is a good woman. She feeds people. Trust her. I know you became a teacher. I know you married a good man named Ethan. I know you had a little girl, Emma. There is more in this unit than a workshop. There is more than these letters. There is a future I built for you, one board and $1, and one prayer at a time. But you have to be ready to receive it. Read the letters in order. Take your time, and when you have questions, ask Ruth. She has been waiting for you almost as long as I have. I love you. I have always loved you. Your grandfather, Henry." I folded the letter very carefully, like it was a living thing. I put it back in its envelope. I put the envelope back in the ammo box. I closed the lid. I stood up. My legs didn't want to hold me. Ruth caught my arm. She just walked me out of the storage unit, into the last light of the afternoon, and she said, "Come home with me, sweetheart. You're not sleeping in that car tonight." I said, "Ruth." She said, "I know." She led me back to my Honda, and she drove me down the mountain to a diner on the corner of Main and Larkspur, and she took me up a back staircase to a small room over the kitchen with a bed and a window and a quilt she had made herself. She said, "This is yours for as long as you need it." She said, "There is soup on the stove when you're hungry." She said, "There is no rush. There is no clock. There is only tomorrow." She closed the door, and for the first time in 8 months, I slept in a real bed. I clutched the little wooden bear against my chest all night. I dreamed of a workshop I had not seen in 27 years. I dreamed of Emma on a swing. I dreamed of a river and 4 skipping stones. I woke up to sunlight through a lace curtain and the smell of bacon rising up through the floorboards. For one moment, one strange, disoriented moment, I forgot everything. Then I remembered, and then, from downstairs, I heard the bell over the front door of the diner. I heard Ruth's voice, sharp, different, careful. She said, "Can I help you?" A man's voice answered, young, confident, practiced. He said, "I'm looking for Claire Bennett. I was told she'd be here." I sat up in the bed. The blanket slid off my shoulders. Ruth said, "Who's asking?" The man said, "My name is Julian Reed. I'm with Blackstone Development." A pause, and then he said the words that told me my 12 days had already started ticking down. He said, "We need to talk about Unit 413. I came down the stairs in yesterday's clothes. Hair a mess, face still puffy, the little wooden bear tucked into the pocket of my sweater, because I couldn't quite bring myself to put it down. Julian Reed was standing at the counter. 30s, dark suit, dark tie, dark coat over one arm. The kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled that morning by a very expensive machine. Except his eyes were tired. Except there was a small coffee stain on his cuff he hadn't noticed. Except when Ruth slid a mug of coffee across the counter to him, he flinched a little, like he wasn't used to being handed things without a bill. He turned when he heard my footsteps. He said, "Ms. Bennett." I said, "That's me." He said, "I'm sorry to intrude on your morning." I said, "You're not sorry." Ruth snorted into a dish towel. Julian Reed's mouth twitched. almost a smile. Almost. He said, I probably deserve that. We sat in a booth by the window. Ruth stayed behind the counter. Not eavesdropping. Not exactly. Just present. Wiping the same spot she'd been wiping the day I walked in. Watching us in the mirror behind the pie case. Julian slid a folder across the table. He said, Blackstone Development purchased the North Ridge storage property in August. All tenants were given notice of termination. Your grandfather's prepaid lease was set to run through April. But there's an accelerator clause in the municipal agreement, and we've invoked it. I said, in English. He said, you have 12 days. I said, I know I have 12 days. He said, we're prepared to offer $500 to close out the unit today. You sign here. You walk away. We handle the rest. He tapped the folder. I looked at his finger. I looked at his face. I said, no. He blinked. He said, I don't think you understand. I said, I understand fine. He said, Ms. Bennett. I said, do you have children, Mr. Reed? He hesitated. He said, my wife is 7 months along. It's a girl. I said, congratulations. He said, thank you. I said, would you take $500 to walk away from her? He didn't answer. He looked down at the folder. His jaw moved once, twice. He said, I'll go back to my people. I'll see what I can do. He stood up. He put his card on the table. He walked out. The bell over the door jingled. Ruth said, from behind the counter, without looking up, that boy is not okay. I said, what? She said, something's wrong with him. Something bigger than a suit. I said, how can you tell? She said, honey, I've been reading faces across this counter for 42 years. That boy came in here already sorry. I asked her if I could stay, just for the 12 days, just until I sorted through the unit. I would pay her when I could. I would work in the diner if she needed me to. She held up a hand. She said, Claire Bennett, you are going to be quiet now. You are going to eat 2 eggs. You are going to take that key back up that mountain. And you are going to stop trying to earn a place to sleep from a woman whose son is alive because of your grandfather. I stopped. I said, what? She poured me coffee. She sat down across from me in the booth. And she told me about Danny. Danny Callahan was Ruth's only son, 20 years old in 2003. Handsome, smart, ruined. Heroin got him at 18. Kept him for 2 years. Ruth said the words the way you say the name of a person who once tried to kill someone you love, flat, factual, no drama, because the drama had already used itself up. She said, I lost him for a while. She said, he stole from me, twice. He stole from the diner, once. She said, I put him out. The 3rd time, I put my boy out. She said, I sat right where you're sitting, and I watched him walk down that street with a garbage bag full of clothes, and I thought I was going to bury him before Christmas. She said, your grandfather found him 3 days later, passed out behind the hardware store. She said, he didn't call the cops. He didn't call me. He put Danny in his truck. He drove him to his workshop. He put him on a cot. And he said, son, you're going to work. She said, Henry didn't lecture him, didn't shame him, just handed him a piece of sandpaper and said, sand this until it's smooth. Danny sanded that piece of pine for 2 days, threw up in a bucket, sweat through 3 shirts, sanded. She said, on the 4th day, Henry drove him to a rehab in West Virginia, paid for the whole thing. Cash, in an envelope. She said, Danny got out 60 days later, clean. She said, he's 41 now, 2 kids, lives in Colorado, runs a cabinet shop. She said, he calls me every Sunday. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She said, your grandfather never asked for a dime, never asked for a thank you, never even told Danny his last name, just said his name was Henry and that he was a friend of the family. She said, You are going to stay in that room upstairs until you decide to leave. And when you leave, you are going to leave the door unlocked in case you ever come back. She stood up. She kissed the top of my head. She said, "Now finish your eggs." I did. I read the letters in order. Ruth gave me a wooden crate to sit on inside the unit. She brought me a thermos of coffee at 11. She brought me a sandwich at 2. She didn't ask questions. She just made sure I ate. I read. Letter 1. 1997. 2 weeks after he left. My Claire. I got off the bus in a town called Cedar Hollow. I don't know why here. I don't know why anywhere. I have $27 and a duffel bag. I sat on a bench outside the post office for 4 hours before I could stand up. Letter 2. 3 weeks after that. I got a job today. Man named Silas Gable owns a hardware store and needs someone who can fix furniture. I told him my name was Henry. He didn't ask what came after that. Letter 3. 2000. Claire, your father passed today. I read it in the paper. I could not go. I could not go. I could not go. I could not go. I sat in the truck outside the funeral home, and I could see your little back in a black coat, and I could not go. Letter 4. Same month. Your mother too. I did not know. They took her together. Claire, I did not know. The paper on that one was warped. I ran my thumb over the warp. I understood what had made it. I stopped for a minute. I stood up. I walked to the doorway of the unit. I looked out at the gravel drive, and the fence, and the mountain rising up behind it. A red-tailed hawk was tracing slow circles over the ridge. I breathed. I breathed. I breathed. Because if I didn't breathe, I was going to break something. Ruth appeared at the end of the row like she'd been summoned. She had 2 tuna sandwiches in wax paper and 2 bottles of water. She said, "Break time." I said, "Yeah." We sat on the tailgate of a truck. That wasn't hers. She didn't ask. I didn't ask. It's that kind of town. We ate in silence. After a while she said, "You want to know how he found out?" I said, "About my parents?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "How?" She said, "Old friend of his, cop, named Roland Beck, worked out of the county down where you grew up. Called Henry about 6 months after the crash." I said, "Called him?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "How did a cop from 300 miles away know how to reach my grandfather?" Ruth looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Honey, that's a story that isn't mine to tell. That's a story that's in that box." She stood up. She brushed crumbs off her apron. She said, "You're going to want to sit down when you get to it." I read for 6 more hours. The light in the unit changed color 3 times. I met my grandfather. Not the ghost. Not the villain. Not the story my mother had told me at the kitchen table when I was 9. The man. The man who had rented a room over a laundromat for 11 years before he could afford a small cabin outside town. The man who had followed my life through the public record like a stalker and a saint at once. My high school graduation, my college dean's list, the tiny wedding announcement in the Riverside Gazette. He'd kept all of it. He'd underlined my name every time. He'd never highlighted the other people in the photos. Just me. I got to 2015. She is here. Emma. Emmeline Rose Marlowe. You named her after my mother. Claire. You named her after my mother and you don't even know why that name was in your head. I wept for an hour. I sat on my porch and I wept like a child. My mother would have been so proud. I got to 2020. Claire. My Claire. I heard about Emma. Ruth got the call. Ruth called me. Ruth drove me down there because I was not fit to drive. I could not go inside. I had promised. I am so sorry. I am so sorry, my girl. I set the letter down. I put my forehead against the workbench. The wood smelled like him. Even after all these years. Even here. The wood smelled like him. Ruth found me like that at 7 in the evening. Head down on the workbench. Not crying. Not moving. Just breathing into the smell of sawdust. And pipe smoke like it was oxygen. She said, "Come home, Claire." I said, "One more," she said. "One more and then home." I said, "One more." She said, "One more." She waited in the doorway while I read one more. August 2000. My Claire. I have to write this letter and I don't want to write this letter and I have to write this letter. Roland Beck called me tonight. He said, "Henry, it wasn't an accident." I said, "What are you telling me?" He said, "The brake lines. Cut. Clean. Someone who knew what they were doing." I said, "Roland." He said, "Henry, I am so sorry." They closed the file. Above my head. Way above my head. I couldn't stop it. "Claire, they killed them. Your father missed a payment. He was trying. They killed him anyway. And your mother with him. To make a point." Roland tried to make the case. He said the pressure came down like a wall. He said if he pushed, he was going to lose his badge and possibly his life. I told him to stand down. I told him, if this comes out, if anyone knows I'm alive, if anyone knows there's a granddaughter, they will come for her next. I told him, bury it. He buried it. I have carried this for 24 years alone. I could not go to the police. I could not go to the papers. I could not go to your grandmother's grave, because your grandmother had been dead for 12 years already. I sat in this workshop, and I built things, because if I built things I did not have to think. Some nights I did not sleep. I just sanded a board for 6 hours, because if I stopped, I would have to remember that my son and his wife were murdered, and that the men who did it walked free, and that my granddaughter was growing up without any of us to protect her. Claire, please, do not chase them. I have watched grief eat men whole. I have watched it eat me for a quarter century. I am asking you not to let it eat you. You are the last of us, my girl. The scream came out of me before I knew it was mine. I slammed my hand down on the workbench. The tools rattled on the pegboard. I hit it again and again, until Ruth's arms were around me, pinning me from behind, and my hand was bleeding, and I was making that animal sound again. Ruth held me up. She kept saying, "I know, I know, I know." And she must have known, because she'd known him, because for 24 years she'd sat across a counter from a man who was carrying a secret that heavy, and she'd fed him bacon, and she'd said nothing, and she'd let him keep it. Ruth Callahan was the strongest woman I had ever met. She wrapped my hand in a dish towel. She drove me back to the diner in my Honda, because I was in no shape. She sat me at the counter and cleaned the cut and put on a proper bandage and made me eat a bowl of soup even though I said I couldn't. She said, "Eat 1 spoon." I said, "Ruth." She said, "1 spoon." I ate 1 spoon. She said, "Another." I said, "I don't want to solve it. I want to burn it down." She said, "I know." She said, "Eat your soup." I met the town in pieces after that. Silas Gable came into the diner the next morning. 72 years old. Red suspenders. Big hands. He walked in slow, like his knees hurt. He saw me. He stopped. He took his cap off. He said, "You're Henry's." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I hired him in 97. He worked 22 years for me. Never late. Not once." He said, "Henry built me the counter in that hardware store you probably drove past. He built the porch on my daughter's house. He built the coffin for my wife when she died in '09 because I couldn't afford one from town." His voice cracked. He said, "He wouldn't take a dime for that coffin. Not 1 dime. Said, Silas, we build for the people we love. That's what wood is for." He put his cap back on. He said, "You need anything. Anything. You come to that hardware store. You just say your name." He walked out. Ruth put a cup of coffee in front of me. She said, "That's a proud man." She said, "He hasn't cried in front of anybody since '09. Wyatt Morrow came in that afternoon. 17. Skinny. Gas station polo. Ball cap over his ears. He said, "Ma'am." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you Miss Bennett?" I said, "I am." He said, "Mr. Henry told me about you. I said, he did. He said, every Saturday. He'd say, Wyatt, you remind me of my Claire. She's a teacher. She's got that same way of listening. Like whatever you're saying is the only thing in the world. I couldn't speak. Wyatt cleared his throat. He said, he put money in an account for me. I didn't know until the lawyer called. He put money in an account for me for college. He looked up. His eyes were red. He said, I don't know what to do with that kind of love. From a man who wasn't even my grandpa. I stood up. I hugged him. A skinny 17-year-old boy in a gas station polo. I hugged him like he was one of my third graders. I hugged him like he was the last piece of Henry Bennett left in the world. He hugged me back. Ruth was crying behind the counter. She wasn't even pretending not to. Father Alden came the next day. 60. Gray beard. Kind eyes. Collar just crooked enough that you could tell he'd put it on in a hurry. He said, Claire. I said, Father. He said, I want to show you something. St. Bartholomew's Church sat on a hill above town. White clapboard. A steeple that leaned very slightly to the left. 12 pews. A pot-bellied stove in the back, that Father Alden lit himself every Sunday, from October to April. He led me down the center aisle. He stopped at a small alcove on the left. Rows of white candles. One of them, in the front, half melted. Wax pooled around it in a soft frozen wave. He pointed to it. He said, That's your grandfather's candle. I stared at it. He said, 27 years, Claire. Every Sunday, rain or snow, he came in. He knelt down. He lit that candle. And he prayed. I said, For what? Father Alden smiled. Small. Sad. He said, He told me once. He said, Father, I light this candle for a little girl named Claire. I light it because she does not know I love her. And a love that a person does not know is still a love. And God knows. I put my hand over my mouth. Father Alden put his hand on my shoulder. He said, Do you want to light one, Claire? I nodded. He handed me a match. I lit the candle next to my grandfather's. I whispered so quietly Father Alden could not hear. I know now, Pop. I know now. The safe was on the 6th day. I found it because Ruth said something offhand. She said, Henry never trusted banks. I said, So where did he keep his money? She said, Where do you think, honey? I went back to the unit. I looked at everything with new eyes. I opened cabinets. I moved boxes. Nothing. Until I got to the tall pine cabinet on the east wall. It looked like a wardrobe. Felt like a wardrobe. Except the bottom was 2 inches too shallow. I got on my knees. I pulled out the false floor. Underneath an old steel safe. Olive drab. The size of a microwave. There was a keyhole. An old keyhole. The kind that took a skeleton key. The kind that took the brass key Margaret Ashford had given me. The key that hadn't fit the padlock on the door. The key I'd been carrying in my pocket for 6 days waiting for a lock to belong to. I put it in. I turned it. The safe opened. Bundles of cash. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Bound in paper bands. Stacked in neat towers. Behind the cash, a large manila envelope. Inside, a quitclaim deed. 7 acres of undeveloped land bordering Sundale National Forest. 15 minutes from where I was kneeling. Recorded and stamped by the county. Transferred to Claire Elizabeth Bennett in February of 2024. 5 months before he died. Behind the deed, a set of rolled blueprints, held together with a dry rubber band. I unrolled them on the workbench. Blueprints for a cabin. 1 bedroom, a great room, a wood stove, porch. In the corner, in careful block letters, a home for Claire. And underneath, in smaller handwriting, almost apologetic, great room is big enough for 10 small desks. You are still a teacher, aren't you? I stopped breathing for a full second. He knew. He knew I was a teacher. He hadn't just built me a house. He'd built me a school. There was also a USB drive. I took it back to the diner. Ruth had an old laptop she used to email her son on Sundays. She set it up on the counter. I plugged it in. 1 file. For Claire. I clicked. Henry Bennett filled the screen. 78 years old. Thin. Cheekbones sharp. Blue flannel shirt. Hair white and combed. Hands folded on a workbench I now knew by heart. He looked into the camera. He said, "Claire." He said my name, and I put my hand over my mouth because I had never heard his voice as a grown woman. His voice was low. A little rough, like sawdust and pipe smoke, and 100 cups of black coffee. He said, "I don't know when you'll see this, but I made it in case you did." He coughed. He said, "I paid off the debt in July of 2005. I could have come back then. I want you to know that." He said, "I didn't." He said, "Because by 2005 you were becoming Claire, the Claire I could see even from a distance. I looked at your life, and I thought, she does not need a ghost in her doorway. She needs to be free." He said, "I was probably wrong. I've thought about that for 19 years. He said, "I'm sorry." He looked down. He looked up. He said, "There is one more thing." He said, "I heard about what happened at your school." I sat up. Ruth was completely still behind the counter. He said, "I heard about the woman named Vanessa Prescott. I heard about the lies. I heard about Ethan leaving." He said, "I hired a man, a good man. He looked into things. I have the evidence you need. All of it. In the bottom drawer of the workbench, there is a yellow envelope." He said, "You do with it what you want. That's your choice, Claire. That was never mine." He looked into the camera. He said, "But whatever you choose, you are not a bad teacher. You are not a bad woman. You are not what they said." He said, "You are my Claire, and I loved you every day, every single day." He said, "Even the days you did not know it." He smiled, very small, very tired. He said, "Good night, my girl." The video ended. Ruth was crying with her whole body, silent, hunched over, face in her hands. I closed the laptop. I said, "Ruth." She said, "I loved him, Claire. Not romantic, not confessional, just factual." She said, "I loved him like a brother, like a father, like a friend. I loved him for 27 years and I never got to tell him, and I have been sitting behind this counter for 3 months waiting for you to walk through that door so I could give him back to somebody." I reached across the counter. I took her hand. I said, "You did save him, Ruth." I said, "You saved him 1,000 times." We sat like that until the sun went down. I drove back up to the unit at first light. I opened the workbench drawer. Bottom drawer. Yellow envelope. Inside, everything. Copies of Vanessa Prescott's emails to Principal Colette Prescott. Screenshots of falsified vendor invoices totaling $47,214.72. A signed affidavit from a woman named Patricia Hayes, a teacher I remembered vaguely. And on top of it all, a business card. Delilah Foster, attorney at law, civil rights and wrongful termination. A sticky note on the back, in Henry's handwriting. "I've already called her. She's waiting for you." I sat down on the concrete floor. I laughed. I laughed because for the first time in 18 months I had leverage. I laughed because my grandfather, from beyond the grave, had handed me a match. Julian Reed came back that afternoon. Same suit, same tired eyes. He sat down across from me at Ruth's counter without asking. He said, 8,000. I said, "No." He said, "Ms. Bennett." I said, "No." He said, "You're being emotional." Ruth said, from behind the counter, without looking up, "Boy, you do not want to say that word to that woman right now." Julian closed his mouth. He tried again. He said, "Blackstone has relationships with the state teaching board. Whatever paperwork your lawyer is preparing, whatever evidence you think you have, it doesn't matter if you can't get relicensed. And we can make sure you never get relicensed." He said it flat, like he was reading a menu. But when I looked at his eyes, they were somewhere else, somewhere far. He was reading from a script. He was reading from a script, and hating himself for every word. I said, "Get out." He stood up. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. He said, "Ms. Bennett." I said, "What?" He said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I really am." And he walked out into the parking lot, and he sat behind the wheel for a full minute before he drove away. Ruth said, "That boy is about to snap in half." I said, "Yeah." She said, "He's going to come back." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because that's what a man does when he's been carrying a secret longer than he can hold." I drove out to a rest stop that night. I couldn't sleep in Ruth's guest room. Everything was too soft. Everything was too kind. I parked at a scenic overlook on Route 219, and I called my mother. The nurse answered. She said, "Oh, Claire. She's having a rough one tonight." I said, "That's okay. Just put her on." She put her on. My mother said, "Hello." I said, "Mom, it's Claire." Silence. She said, "Claire." I said, Yeah, Mom. It's me." She said, "I don't have a daughter named Claire." I closed my eyes. She said, "I had a sister named Claire, but she died. She died a long time ago." I said, "Mom." She said, "Who is this?" I said, "Mom, it's the woman who visits you on Sundays. Remember, I bring you those butterscotches, the ones with the yellow wrappers." Long pause. She said, Oh, honey, I'm sorry. I get so mixed up." She said, "I have a daughter, you know. She's a teacher." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Everyone loves her." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you a teacher?" I said, "I used to be." She said, "Well, you should go back to it, honey. The world needs teachers." I said, "Yeah, Mom." She said, "I have to go now. My show is on." She hung up. I sat with the phone against my ear until the line went silent. Then I put my head against the steering wheel, and I cried the tired kind of crying, the kind that has no bottom. For one bad second, I thought I could take the 8,000. I could go back. I could give up. Wouldn't that be so much easier? Then I heard my grandfather's voice, not from a letter, from the river. "Bennett's don't punch. Bennett's kiss the water." I started the car. I drove back to Cedar Hollow. Ruth was already up. She was setting up the coffee urn. She looked at me. She saw everything. She said, "You made a decision." I said, "I did." She said, "Good." She reached under the counter. She pulled out an old leather-bound Bible. She set it in front of me. She said, "Henry gave me this to give to you, if you ever showed up looking like you were about to walk away. He said, Ruth, if you see her when she can't take another step, you give her this. You tell her the page." I said, "What page?" She opened it. She turned to a page marked with a pressed sunflower petal. Isaiah 43, verse 19. I read it out loud. "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth, do you not perceive it?" Ruth said, "He believed that, Claire. He believed that with his whole heart." I looked at her. I looked at the little wooden bear on the counter beside my coffee cup. I said, "Ruth, I'm going to stay." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to build the cabin." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to start the school." She said, "Oh, honey, I know." She reached across the counter. She took both of my hands in hers. She said, "Now let's go get your granddaddy's things off that mountain." And I laughed. For the first time in a very long time, I laughed. The last letter was still sealed. I'd been carrying it in my coat pocket for 11 days. "When you know everything." That was all the outside said. I opened it on the morning of day 12. I was sitting on the iron-bound chest in the storage unit. The light through the doorway was gray and thin. Ruth was outside in her truck, giving me space. I opened the envelope. I read, "My dearest Claire, if you have gotten to this letter, then you know all of it. The debt, the men, the lies, your mother and father, the candle, the savings, The land. You know. So now I want to tell you the only thing I have left to tell you. Revenge will not bring them back. I know you know this. But I need you to read it in my handwriting. I need you to see it in the shape of my letters. Because I lived with this question for 24 years, and I want to spare you even a day of it if I can. Do not chase them, Claire. Not with your own two hands. Not with a hired man. Not with a plan. Use the evidence about Prescott. Use it fully. But use it to walk toward your own life, not back into the one they tried to take from you. The land is yours. The money is yours. The blueprints are a suggestion. Build whatever you need to build. Teach whoever needs to be taught. Love whoever walks through your door. And on the days when the grief comes back, and it will come back, Claire, that is the price of loving people. Sit down at the workbench and put your hands on the wood. Let the wood remember you. Let it remember me. Let it remember Emma. I love you. I have always loved you. Live, my girl. Please. Live. Your grandfather, Henry. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope on top of the stack in the ammo box. I closed the lid. I stood up. My knees were shaky. My eyes were dry. I walked out into the gray morning. Ruth was in her truck with the heater running. She held out her hand. I took it. I climbed in. I said, Ruth. She said, yes, honey. I said, let's go home. She said, which home, sweetheart? I said, both. She smiled. She put the truck in gear. I called Delilah Foster from the counter at Ruth's kitchen at 9:30 in the morning. She picked up on the first ring. She said, this is Delilah. I said, my name is Claire Bennett. There was a pause. Then she said, oh, honey, your grandfather called me 11 months ago. I have been keeping a file for you for 11 months. I said, Delilah. She said, I want to be honest with you about how this works. These things move slowly. School districts don't like being wrong. It's going to take weeks to get their attention and months to get a resolution. She said, but I have been practicing this kind of law for 22 years, and I have seen what your grandfather put together, and I can tell you, this is the cleanest case I have ever been handed. I said, how long, realistically? She said, 4 to 6 months. Maybe more. I'm going to send a demand letter this week. Then I wait. Then I file. Then I wait. Then we negotiate. Then we see. I said, okay. She said, there is one more thing, Claire. I said, what? She said, I don't want you back in that district. Not for the fight. Not for the process. My office handles all of that. You go build the life you're building. You send me pictures of the cabin. You come to court only if we go to court. I said, Delilah. She said, yes. I said, I don't want my job back. Silence. Then, very quietly, she said, then what do you want? I said, I want my name back. I want my license. I want them to pay for what they took. I want it in writing. She said, okay. She said, okay, Claire. She said, we're going to do that. I called Ethan next. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was smaller than I remembered. He said, Claire. I said, Ethan. He said, God, Claire, I've been trying to reach you. I said, Ethan. He said, I know. Just please, let me say it. I said, say it. He said, I was wrong. He said, I was wrong, and I was a coward, and I let a woman I had never met tell me a story about my own wife. And I believed her, because it was easier than believing the truth about what we had lost. He said, I miss you. He said, I miss us. He said, come home. I closed my eyes. I could see the yellow house, the porch swing. I could see Emma's bedroom. I could see her drawings on the fridge. I could feel exactly how it would go if I said yes. I said, Ethan, I forgive you. He inhaled sharply. I said, I really do. I've been carrying it for 1.5 years and I don't want to carry it anymore. So I'm setting it down. Okay. He said, Okay, I said, but I'm not coming back. Silence. He said, Claire. I said, I'm not coming back, because Emma doesn't come back, if we get back together. She doesn't, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending she might. He was crying. I could hear him crying. He said, Where are you going to go? I said, Home. I'm going home, to a place he built for me. He said, Who? I said, My grandfather. There was a long silence. Then he said, I'm glad, Claire. He said, I'm really glad. He said, Take care of yourself, okay? I said, You too, Ethan. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. I felt light. I felt like a door had closed, that had been swinging in the wind for 18 months. Ruth put a fresh coffee in front of me. She said, That was a good goodbye, honey. I said, It was, wasn't it? Julian Reed came back at 3 in the afternoon. No suit. That was the first thing I noticed. He walked into the diner in a gray hoodie and jeans and a pair of work boots that had actually seen work. He came to my booth. He said, Ms. Bennett, can I speak with you privately? Ruth said, Use the back room. Nobody goes in there but me. She closed the door. She stood outside the door with a rolling pin. I could see her shadow through the crack. That woman. Julian sat down across from me. He put his hands flat on the table. They were shaking. He said, My name is Julian Reed. My father's name was Roland Beck. I stopped breathing. He said, He was a county sheriff. He worked in Millbrook from 94 to 2005. He was the officer of record on the case of your parents' fatal accident. I said, Julian. He said, Please let me finish. I'm not sure I can start again if you stop me. I said, Okay. He said, My dad wasn't a bad man. He was a scared man. The pressure came from 3 levels above him, and he did what a lot of scared men in that position have done. He signed the paperwork. He closed the file. He said, He knew the brakes had been cut. He said, He called an old friend of his that lived up in the mountains, a carpenter named Henry Bennett. He told him what really happened. He begged him not to try anything. He said, and then he drank himself to death for the next 15 years. He looked at his hands. He said, I was 10 when he told me. On the porch. Drunk. He made me promise not to tell my mother, and then he passed out. He said, He died in 2015. I moved to the city. I got a business degree. I got a job at a firm that specialized in commercial acquisitions. Blackstone hired us in 2021. He said, That's when I started noticing things. He said, Companies inside companies. Shell corporations. A pattern of investment that traced back to a group of men my father had mentioned by name on the porch that night. He said, They own Blackstone. Not on paper, but if you follow the money, they own it. He said, And Blackstone bought the storage facility your grandfather rented. He said, I don't know if it's a coincidence. Blackstone owns 12 facilities. It might have been random. He said, or it might not have been. He said, I've been collecting evidence for 3 years. Internal emails, financial records, a pattern that maps to 7 other suspicious deaths in 5 states. I have it on a flash drive. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie. He put a red USB drive on the table. He slid it across. He said, I can't come forward with this myself. My wife is 7 months pregnant. My mother is alive. If my name is on this, they'll find me. He said, But you have a lawyer. You have leverage. If you take this to a federal prosecutor, through your attorney, through the right channels, my name doesn't have to come up. He said, I know what I'm asking. He said, But my father did the wrong thing 30 years ago, and I have carried it for 2 decades, and I am so tired of carrying it. He looked up at me for the first time since he sat down. His eyes were exactly like mine had been in the parking lot of a truck stop off Route 219, 12 nights ago. He said, Please, Ms. Bennett. I sat with the USB drive on the table between us. I said, Julian. He said, yes. I said, I need to think. Can I have until tomorrow morning? He said, yes. He stood up. He picked up the USB drive. He said, it goes with you or it stays with me. I won't leave it here. He put it in his pocket. He said, I'll be at the motel on Route 12, room 7. He left. Ruth came in. She looked at me. She said, well. I said, well. She said, that's a mess. I said, yes it is. She said, you want a piece of pie? I said, yes, God, yes. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed in Ruth's guest room, wrapped in her handmade quilt, and I looked out at the mountain. I prayed, not to anyone in particular, not in any formal way. I just talked, into the dark. I said, Emma, baby, I need help. I said, Pop, I need help too. I said, I don't know if this is justice or if this is revenge with better paperwork. I said, you told me not to chase them, Pop. I said, but maybe someone should. Maybe not me. Maybe the government. With real prosecutors and real evidence and real time. Not me with a hammer in my hand and a hole in my chest. I said, somebody has to stop being scared. The room was quiet. The mountain was quiet. But I felt a warm certainty in my chest, like a hand laid on it. I don't know what that was. I don't know if it was God or grief or just my own body finally telling me the truth I already knew. Whatever it was, I listened. I called Delilah at 7 in the morning. I said, Delilah, there is a second matter, a larger matter. It has nothing to do with Prescott. She said, tell me. I did. Julian. Roland Beck. The USB. My terms. I said, Delilah, I want this handed to the federal prosecutor's office through a channel that protects the source. I want Julian Reed's name kept out of it. If those conditions can't be met, we don't do it. She said, Claire. She said, that is exactly the right way to do this. She said, I have a colleague in the U.S. Attorney's Office who has worked source-protected homicide cases for over a decade. I will call her personally. This will move slowly. It might move for years. You may never know the outcome, but it will be handled properly. I said, do it. I hung up. I texted Julian. I said, come to the diner. He came in 15 minutes. He handed the drive to me under the table. I said, Julian. He said, yes. I said, your daughter is going to grow up with a father who did the right thing. He put his face in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he lifted his head, he said, thank you, Ms. Bennett. I said, Claire. He said, Claire. He said, I have to go. I said, go home to your wife, Julian. He did. He never came back to Cedar Hollow. Day 12. Move-out day. I have never seen a town show up the way Cedar Hollow showed up. Silas Gable arrived at dawn in his flatbed truck. He was wearing his suspenders and his good boots. He said, where do you want it, Miss Bennett? Wyatt Morrow came with his uncle's van. His uncle came too. His uncle's name was Cal. Cal shook my hand and said, Henry taught my boy to read a level. That's a debt. Father Alden came in a station wagon that was older than Wyatt. Two women I had never met came in an SUV with rolled sleeves. They said, we're friends of Ruth's. That's all you need to know. A quiet man named Frank came with a pickup and started loading tools. By 9 in the morning, there were 9 vehicles in the gravel lot. Father Alden stood at the door of Unit 413. He said, before we begin, if it's all right with Claire. Everyone stopped. He put his hand on the metal doorframe. He said, Lord, this unit held a workshop. It held a life. It held a love that survived 27 years of silence. We ask you now to move this love to a new place. Amen. Everyone said amen. Ruth crossed herself. Then we got to work. We moved the workbench first. Took 6 of us. Silas directed. He knew where every scar on it had come from. We moved the tool cabinet, the lumber, the stacks of finished projects Henry had built and never delivered, a rocking chair, 2 side tables, a cedar chest with brass hinges. We moved the boxes. The ammo box came in the cab of my Honda on my lap, buckled with the seatbelt around it. I could not put it in a truck. I could not. Ruth understood without asking. Halfway through the day, a black SUV pulled into the lot. Not Julian, a different man, middle-aged, bored. He walked up with a clipboard. He said, "Ms. Bennett, I need you to sign the release. Confirm the unit is cleared." I said, "It's cleared, almost." He waited by his SUV on his phone for the next 3 hours. When the last box was loaded, I walked over. I handed him the padlock key. I handed him the brass key. I said, "Tell your bosses that Henry Bennett said hello." He looked at me strangely. He said, "Who?" I said, "Never mind." I got in my Honda. I drove up the mountain. I did not look back. The land was 7 acres of the most beautiful country I have ever seen. A stand of white pines, a creek that ran through the northeast corner, a clearing in the middle almost perfectly shaped for the cabin Henry had drawn. The convoy pulled onto the property in a cloud of dust. Everyone got out. Everyone was quiet. Ruth was the first to speak. She said, "Oh, Henry, you picked well. We didn't build the cabin that day." Of course we didn't. Silas walked the ground with me. He said, "You know when you're going to break ground, Miss Bennett?" I said, "As soon as possible." He said, "Not around here you don't." He said, "The ground's frozen 12 inches down by Thanksgiving. You can't pour a footer on frozen ground. You'll set foundations in April, once we've had a run of warm nights. Not before." I said, "So what do I do for 5 months?" He said, "You dry the wood. You cut the joinery. You mill the boards. You get every single piece ready so that when the frost lifts you can raise the frame in a week." He said, "That's how Henry would have done it." He smiled, small, sad, familiar. He said, "I'll help you. You don't get to say no." We set up a work site. We built a lean-to for the tools. We laid tarps over the lumber. Cal and Silas marked the outline of the foundation with stakes and string, so I could see the shape of what would come in the spring. I bought a used camper from a man in town for $1,100. Wyatt and Cal drove it up on day 14. That was where I lived. The camper was small. It leaked in one corner. The stove had 2 burners. I loved it more than any house I had ever owned. Because it was mine. Because when I woke up in the morning, I could see the mountain through the windshield, and the mountain smelled the way the workbench had smelled, and I understood I was home. The winter was long. I will not pretend it wasn't. The temperature in that camper dropped into the low 40s every night in December. I bought a second space heater with the money from a small job Silas gave me, refinishing an antique dresser for a family in the next county over. I heated water on the stove. I brushed my teeth over a bucket. I read my grandfather's letters by lantern light, and I reread them, and I wrote in a notebook, and I slept in 3 pairs of socks. I visited my mother in December. I drove 3 hours down the mountain. I brought her butterscotches in yellow wrappers. She was having a good day. Not a great one, but a good one. She said, "Claire." I said, "Hi, Mom." She said, "You look different, honey." I said, "Do I?" She said, You look like your grandfather. You have his eyes." I said, "I know now, Mom." She looked at me with the whole of herself, the pieces of her that were still there. She said, "He loved you, honey. Even when we didn't understand it." I said, "I know now." She said, "Good." She patted my hand. She said, "Now tell me about the little kids in your class." I said, "Mom, I stopped, because I was going to say I wasn't teaching yet. But I was about to be." I said, "Mom, there's going to be a little girl named Lily. She likes to draw. She's a lot like Emma was." My mother smiled. She said, "Well, tell her hi from me." Tell her grandma says hi. I said, I will. I kissed her on the forehead. I drove back up the mountain. I cried the whole way. They were good tears. Delilah called me in February. She said, Prescott is moving. I said, moving how? She said, the demand letter went out in November. Took them 6 weeks to acknowledge it. Their lawyer called me 2 days ago. They want to settle. I said, Delilah. She said, it's not final. Nothing is final until it's signed. But the terms they've put on the table are $150,000. Full restoration of your license, effective immediately upon signing. A written statement going into your permanent file, retracting the complaint. Vanessa Prescott has already been terminated. Colette Prescott resigned last week. I said, Delilah. She said, sign it, honey. Take the win. It'll take the district another few months to run the paperwork through the state board. But by early summer you should have your license back in your hand. I said, okay. She said, and the second matter. I said, yes. She said, it went to the right desk. It is being pursued. That is all I can tell you. That is all I know. But the woman who has it is not going to let it go. I said, that's enough. She said, I thought you'd say that. I said, Delilah. She said, yes. I said, thank you. She said, send me a picture of the cabin when it's done. I said, I will. The frost lifted in the 3rd week of April. We poured the footers on a Monday. Frank did the wiring in May. When I tried to pay him, he said, Henry fixed my roof in '09. Stephen. Marlene and Beth planted a garden. Tomatoes, beans, a whole row of sunflowers along the eastern fence. I did not tell them why sunflowers. Ruth had already told them gently on the drive up the first day. Father Alden came once a week and blessed whatever we had just built. The foundation, the framing, the roof line, the front porch on the day the porch was finished. The frame went up in a week, just like Silas had promised. The roof was on by the end of May. The interior walls followed in June. By the beginning of July, the cabin was a cabin. Mine. On the last week of the build, I took Wyatt's little sister Lily down to the creek. She was 9, big glasses, a little quiet around most people. Ruth had told me Lily hadn't spoken in a classroom for 2 straight years. I showed her the flat stones. I said, you want me to teach you something my grandpa taught me? She nodded. I picked out a smooth gray stone. I put it in her hand. I said, Lily, you don't punch the water. You kiss it. You let the stone tell the water hello, and the water lets it go. She frowned. She said, that's a lot of instructions. I laughed. I laughed hard. I said, you're right. Try again. Just kiss the water. She threw 2 skips. She gasped. She said, did you see that? I said, I saw it, honey. She said, can I do it again? I said, you can do it 100 times. She did it 100 times. Wyatt watched us from the bank. He said, when I walked back up, that's the most she's talked in a year, Miss Bennett. I couldn't answer. I just squeezed his shoulder. The night before the school opened, I couldn't sleep. I got up. I paced the great room. I ran my hand along the paneling on the eastern wall, the wall where the chalkboard hung, and one of the boards sounded hollow when I tapped it. Just one. The 3rd one from the window. I remembered. There was a note in the margin of Henry's blueprints. A note I hadn't understood. 3rd board from east window. Compartment. For later. I took a screwdriver from the toolbox on the porch. I pried the board off gently so I wouldn't split it. Behind it, a small carved wooden box. Cedar. Sanded smooth. The lid inlaid with a tiny sunflower. I sat down on the floor with the box in my lap. I opened it. Inside, a small photograph. Emma. Emma at the swings in the park in Riverside on the day she was 4. Laughing. Head thrown back. Curls flying. I did not have this photograph. I had never seen this photograph. Because Henry Bennett had taken it. from behind a tree, at a distance, on a spring afternoon in 2019, when I had been pushing my daughter on a swing, and I had not known that anyone was watching us with love. Underneath the photograph, a small envelope, tiny, the size of a business card. Inside, a baby tooth. My first tooth. My mother had sent it to him in '94, before he vanished. Underneath the tooth, a folded piece of paper. His handwriting, Claire. Nothing that is loved is ever really lost. You are not walking through this alone. You never were. Yours forever, Pop. I sat on the floor for a long time. I was not sobbing. I was quiet. I put the photograph on the mantel above the wood stove, right where every child in every class would see it all the years I taught in that room. Emma on a swing, laughing, forever 4. The next morning was the first day of school. I woke at 5. I made coffee. I sat on the porch swing. The sun came up over the ridge and turned the whole east side of the cabin gold. Ruth arrived at 7 with a tray of cinnamon rolls. She said, "For the kids." She said, "I made 120 of them." I said, "Ruth, there are only 8 kids." She said, "The rest are for me, honey." I laughed. Father Alden arrived to bless the doorway. He said, "Bless the school. Bless the teacher. Bless every child who will cross this threshold. Bless the man who dreamed it. Bless the granddaughter who built it." Amen. Everyone said amen. The parents started arriving at 8. The first car up the drive was Wyatt's uncle's van. Lily Morrow got out, 9 years old, big glasses, a backpack that was too big for her shoulders. She was holding a stuffed rabbit under one arm. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the sunflowers along the eastern fence. She looked at me. She said, "Miss Bennett." I said, "Yes, honey." She said, "I brought something." She reached into her backpack. She pulled out a flat gray stone. She said, "I found this by the creek. It's a good one. I want to keep it in the classroom, for when I get scared." I knelt down. I put my hands on her shoulders. I said, "That's a perfect stone, Lily." She said, "It's for kissing the water." I said, "It's for kissing the water." They filed in, 8 of them, ages 6 through 11. A boy whose family lived off-grid. 2 sisters whose father worked 3 jobs. Lily Morrow. I stood at the front of the great room. The chalkboard behind me. Emma's photograph above the wood stove behind them. Ruth in the doorway with her cinnamon rolls. Father Alden on the porch swing. Silas at the tailgate of his truck, arms crossed, hat off. I wrote on the chalkboard, "Welcome to Miss Bennett's classroom." I turned around. 8 small faces, 8 sets of eyes, 8 blank notebooks, 8 sharpened pencils. Lily raised her hand. She had not raised her hand in a classroom in 2 years. I said, "Yes, Lily." She said, "Miss Bennett, why is the school in the woods?" I said, "That's a good question, honey." I said, "Because someone loved me very much, and he wanted me to have a place where I could love other kids, just like I love all of you today." Lily looked at the photograph over the wood stove. She said, "Miss Bennett." I said, "Yes." She said, "Who's the little girl in the picture?" I took a breath. I said, "That's my daughter, Lily. Her name was Emma. She liked to draw just like you do." Lily said, "Is she here?" I said, "Yes, honey. I think she is. I think she's watching us right now, and I think she's very happy." Lily nodded like this was a completely normal thing to say. She said, "Cool." She opened her notebook. She started to draw. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. Cedar Hollow Cemetery. Small. Well kept. Henry Bennett's grave was near the back. Simple. Just a granite stone. Henry William Bennett, 1945. 2024, he built things that lasted. Father Alden had planted sunflowers along one side. They weren't blooming yet, but they would be. I knelt down. I put a small wooden box on the grass. I had made it myself. My first cabinetry project. Ruth had helped me sand it. Silas had shown me how to notch the joints. It was crooked in one corner. I had left the crooked part on purpose. Felt more like me that way. Inside, a photograph of me and 8 children in front of the cabin. A drawing Lily had made on her first day, the cabin and me and a little girl with dark hair and freckles holding my hand. A smooth gray river stone. A letter. Pop, I understand now. I forgive you. I built it. I'm living. Thank you for becoming the villain of my story, so I would have a story worth living. I get to be the good guy in someone else's story now. That's how I pay you back. Emma is playing in the sky with you. I believe that now. I really do. I taught Lily to skip stones today, Pop. She got 2 skips on her first try. She's going to keep the stone in the classroom. For when she gets scared. Bennett's kiss the water. You told me that 30 years ago. I remembered. I love you always. You're Claire. I sat with the box for a while. The wind picked up. Pine needles fell around me. The last light of the afternoon came slanting, through the trees, and it caught on the granite of Henry's headstone. And for one strange second it looked like the stone was glowing from inside. I stood up. I brushed off my knees. I said quietly, I'm okay, Pop. I'm going to be okay. I turned around. I got back in my Honda. I drove home. To the cabin. To the mountain. To the 8 children who would come back on Monday morning. To Ruth waiting on my porch with a casserole. To a life that a man had built for me, 1 board and $1, and 1 prayer at a time over 27 years of silence. Some inheritances look like burdens. A rusted key. A box of old letters. A story you thought you understood, that turns out to be something else entirely. But if you have the courage to open them, you may find they are not burdens at all. They are maps. They are second chances. They are the whispered voice of someone who loved you more than you ever knew. My story is no longer about what was taken from me. It is about what I chose to build. A cabin. A classroom. A garden of sunflowers. A place for other people's children to be seen. That is my grandfather's justice. That is his love still working in the world. Through my hands. Through mine. For the grandmothers and mothers and teachers who loved quietly, even when no one saw. You were seen. You are seen. You always were.